For the entire year 1943, the score by United States submarines in the Pacific was 22 warships and 296 Maras, the merchant loss amounting to 1,335,240 gross tons. Since Japanese shipyards had produced a little over 500,000 tons of new shipping in 1943 and captured or salvaged about 100,000 tons more, the net loss was 718,000 tons. The United States submarine force that year lost 15 boats and 1,129 officers and men, a heavy toll indeed. Yet the three submarine commands in the Pacific, based at Pearl Harbor, Brisbane and Fremantle, had 75 boats on their rolls on New Year's Day 1944, as against 53 on 1 January 1943. And these 75 were almost all fleet submarines, as most of the aged S-boats had been retired to training centres. In the same 12-month, Japan lost 23 submarines. General MacArthur kept contact with Filipino guerrillas and unsurrendered members of his army by Fremantle-based submarines. During the period 8 February 1943 to 5 March 1944, 19 such missions were performed, 7 by the big 2,700-ton Narwhal, which was especially assigned to this work, and others by fleet submarines. These carried important contact men, such as Lieutenant Commander C. Parsons, to the guerrillas, together with arms, money, munitions, radio sets, and miscellaneous supplies. Narwhal on one voyage took tons to Mindanao and Samar and, on another, evacuated 32 civilians from Panay. These missions were of inestimable value in obtaining intelligence of enemy ship and troop movements, supplying guerrilla forces with munitions and medicaments, and counteracting Japanese propaganda to the effect that America had forgotten the Philippines. In May 1943, Tautog received a special assignment to land 2 pro-Allied Javanese agents on the Celebes. Both were pious Mohammedans, which created difficulties not anticipated by the submarine officer's manual. Spam, ice cream, fried eggs, and other staple submariners' food were taboo. Canned tuna fish and salmon had to be provided, and the navigator acquired a new duty of giving his passengers 4 times daily the course for Mecca. Thus history came full circle, for the science of celestial navigation evolved from this necessity that all sons of the Prophet were under, to project their prayers in the right direction. The vicissitudes of a submariner's life are illustrated by the loss of Sculpin, Commander Fred Conaway, which was stationed between Truk and Ponape during the Gilbert's operation to report Japanese fleet movements. On the night of 18 to 19 November 1943, Sculpin sighted a fast enemy convoy, and at dawn attempted to attack it, submerged, but was detected and forced deep. When she surfaced an hour later, she was immediately forced down and depth-charged by destroyer Yamagumo. When the diving officer tried to bring her to periscope depth, the depth gauge stuck at 125 feet and Sculpin broached. As Yamagumo roared in to attack, the submarine dove deep, but 18 depth charges followed her down. The explosions threw the boat out of control, distorted her pressure hull, started leaks, jammed her rudders and diving planes. As a desperate expedient, Commander Conaway ordered, "Blow all ballast," and then, as Sculpin rose from the depths, gave the signal for gunfire action. Battle surface. Sculpin's 1 4-inch and 2 20mm guns had no chance to fight off a Japanese destroyer, with 6 5.1-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and numerous automatic weapons. She took 1 lethal hit in the main induction valves. A second, penetrating the conning tower, killed the commissioned officer, his executive, and the gunnery officer. The senior surviving officer ordered abandon ship. All vents were opened and Sculpin dove for the last time. Captain John P. Cromwell, a passenger on board, and a dozen others rowed her down, Cromwell deliberately sacrificing his life because he was familiar with operation plans and feared lest information be extorted from him by torture. 42 of Sculpin's crew were picked up by Yamagumo, and with the exception of 1 wounded man, who was thrown overboard, were taken to Truk, where they were transferred to escort carriers Chuyo and Unyo, en route to Japan. Chuyo fell victim to a torpedo attack by United States submarine sailfish, and only one of the prisoners survived. He and 20 prisoners in Unyo were forced to work in the copper mines at Ashio until released at the end of the war. On 1 January 1944, the Japanese still had 300,000 more tanker tonnage than on 7 December 1941. United States submarines made a special effort to correct this. That month, 8 more enemy tankers were downed, 1 to a Navy carrier plane and the other 7 to submarines. Greater misfortunes overtook the Japanese oiler fleet next month. The 17 February carrier strike on Truk put 5 tankers totaling 52,183 tons under the surface. And then along came submarine Jack, Commander Thomas M. Dykers, Jack the Tanker Killer, as she was known in the submarine fleet. In the South China Sea at 3:38 a.m. February 19, Dykers made a radar contact on an enemy convoy of 5 tankers and 3 escorts. In a series of attacks that lasted all day and almost until midnight, Jack sank 4 of them, totaling over 20,000 tons. Greyback, Commander John A. Moore, patrolling between Luzon and Formosa, was lost with all hands on 27 February 1944 after sinking 11,500 more tons of shipping. Probably an enemy plane was responsible. Trout, the veteran boat which had carried gold out of Corregidor early in the war, was on her 11th patrol with Lieutenant Commander Albert H. Clark as skipper when, on 29 February, south-southeast of Okinawa, she picked up a Japanese convoy carrying troops from Korea to reinforce the Marianas. She damaged a new 11,500-ton transport and sank a 9,245-tonner which contained 4,124 troops and a crew of 105, half of whom went down with the ship. In the flurry of depth charge attacks that followed, Trout was lost with all hands. Sandlant's Commander Malcolm E. Garrison, on her maiden voyage, patrolled in rough waters. En route Pearl Harbor to the Aleutians in February 1944, she encountered 2 tempests within 4 days and, when surfaced, quickly became sheathed in ice, which she could slough off only by submerging. Arriving on station off Paramushiro 24 February, Sandlant's found herself completely surrounded by drift ice. The temperature dropped so that the seawater froze over the periscope in a film of ice. Despite these difficulties, Commander Garrison conned his boat along the Kurils and Hokkaido, knocking off a freighter on 28 February and another on 3 March, evading all attacks by patrol craft and planes. Eventually he entered the Japan Current, and water temperature promptly rose from barely freezing to 70° Fahrenheit. Sandlant's passed Honshu and down along the Bonins. During the mid-watch 13 March, when his sound operator reported echoes, Garrison brought his boat to periscope depth to view a sight beautiful to behold, worth the past 4 weeks of battling typhoons, blizzards, and ice fields. We were completely surrounded by ships. He had run into a second Marianas-bound Japanese reinforcement convoy. A full moon enabled him to select the best targets, light cruiser Tatsuta and a large freighter. At 3:10 a.m., Sandlant's shot 2 torpedoes at each, then swung 180 degrees and fired her last 2 Fishtat 4-second Maru. In a jiffy, she was surrounded by wildly depth-charging escorts which could not locate her. Garrison coolly kept his boat at periscope depth for 15 minutes to watch developments. In that time he observed that Tatsuta was sinking and that the first Maru was burning, decks awash, and he saw the victim of his Parthian shot go down rapidly bow first. The destroyers then forced him down and kept him down for 18.5 hours, after which, with all torpedoes expended, Sandlant's shaped a course to Pearl Harbor, where Pacific Fleet submariners enjoyed a little recreation between patrols. By April 1944, the scorekeepers in Washington concluded that the Japanese Navy must be getting short of destroyers, since it had lost 64, and few new ones had been built. Admiral King decided that it was time to decrease the small number left. On 13 April, he issued an order to Pacific Fleet submarines to give enemy destroyers No. 2 priority as targets, after capital ships but ahead of transports, tankers and freighters. United States submariners hardly needed this to persuade them to turn on their traditional enemies. Albacore had already sunk Sazanami, Skipjack had sunk Suzukaze in January. Guardfish put Umikaze down for keeps, and Pogi sank Minakaze in the East China Sea in February. Tautog sank Shirakumo off Hokkaido 16 March, and Redfin disposed of Akigumo in April, all before Admiral King issued his order. In the meantime, Rear Admiral Christie's Southwest Pacific submarines, based at Fremantle, were finding good hunting in the Sulu and Celebes seas. A convoy carrying an infantry division to reinforce the Japanese positions on the Vogelkop lost 3 transports to Gurnard. Commander Charles H. Andrews and thousands of soldiers were drowned. This discouraged the relief of Biak. Lapon and Raton made a good bag in the South China Sea in May 1944. Rasher, Commander Henry G. Munson, hit the jackpot on 18 August, sinking escort carrier Taiyo, which had been used to furnish combat air patrol for the big battleships. Southwest Pacific submarines continued to keep Filipino guerrillas informed and supplied, evacuating marooned Americans and endangered Filipinos on the return passage. Angler, Lieutenant Commander R. 1 Olson, was ordered to rescue about 20 Filipinos, on whom the Japanese were closing, from a point on the coast of Panay. When Olson surfaced off the rendezvous on 20 March 1944, he was informed that 58 men, women and children had been assigned to him as passengers. After hiding from the Japanese in the jungle for over 2 years, many of these unfortunate people were sick, and all were undernourished, dirty and lousy. Many had tropical ulcers, and one woman was expecting a baby. But a submariner is never nonplussed. The entire crew of Angler, during the 12-day run to Darwin, was berthed in the after-battery compartment, male passengers in the forward torpedo room, and women and children in the after-torpedo room. It was on this passage that the bluejackets felt that they had seen everything when a nursing mother, after smoking a large cigar while nursing her infant, let the suckling take a few drags at it after he had finished feeding. Food had to be strictly rationed, but all passengers were landed without a casualty. In June 1944, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea was over, more submarines were released for the pursuit of Japanese merchant shipping, and the area which Submarine Force United States Pacific Fleet named Convoy College, extending across the East China Sea from Luzon Strait to Formosa and the coast of China, became the scene of great destruction. The Mickey Finns, Guardfish, Piranha, Thresher and Apagon, a wolf pack under command of Captain W. Fivo Regan, were the first freshmen to cross this watery campus, and their 5-day semester cost the Japanese some 41,000 more tons of merchant shipping. A night battle fought in Luzon Strait during the early hours of 31 July 1944 between Steelhead, Parche and Hammerhead and a big convoy accounted for a tanker, 2 transports and 2 passenger cargo ships, totalling over 39,000 tons. By this time, Saipan being secured, Tender Holland moved up there to afford the submarines a forward fueling and repair base, 3,600 miles west of Pearl Harbor. With hunting grounds restricted by the westward advance of American sea power and Japanese shipping accordingly canalized to the narrow seas, convoys became larger and hunting more profitable. The first day of September found subpack boats vigorously and successfully combing waters around Formosa. Captain E. R. Swinburne's Wolfpack, Barb, Tunny and Queenfish, was enjoying a profitable term in Convoy College, whose campus extended from Pratas Reef south to Swatow through Luzon Strait to longitude 130° east. A transport, a 10,000-ton tanker and a destroyer escort fell to their bag. Commander G. R. Donahoe's pack, consisting of picuda, redfish and spadefish, on 8 September, east of Formosa, sank 3 or 4 merchant ships out of a single convoy. By the time Donahoe had concluded his patrol, on 21 September, he had eliminated 64,456 tons of enemy shipping, the highest Wolfpack score so far. A third Wolfpack in this scholarly area during September was Commander T. B. Oakley's, Growler, Pampanito and Cialian II. During the night of 11 to 12 September, they picked up a Singapore-Japan convoy of 9 ships with 7 escorts, about halfway between Hainan and Cape Boyador, Luzon. After Growler had blown up frigate Hirado, Cialian at 5:24 a.m. torpedoed 3 ships, one of which, unfortunately, had on board 1,350 English and Australian prisoners of war. In the meantime, Growler at 6:53 a.m. sank destroyer Shikinami, after which the convoy turned and fled toward Hong Kong. But Pampanito hung on all day 12 September, and at 10:40 p.m. sank a tanker and 10,509-ton Kachidoki Maru, in which were 750 prisoners. The Japanese escorts picked up their own survivors next day, but left the prisoners struggling in the water. Many managed to survive by clinging to wreckage, and some were rescued by the submarines. In October 1944, 68 United States submarines sank 320,906 tons of Japanese merchant shipping, the highest monthly score of the war, and almost one-third of it consisted of tankers. In November, 214,506 more tons were sunk. In early October, a bold raid into the Formosa Channel was performed by Commander Richard H. O'Kane in USS Tang. This was her fifth war patrol. After safely weathering a typhoon on 6 October, Tang threaded an enemy minefield between Formosa and the Sakashima Gunto and passed close aboard the northern extremity of Formosa. At 9 a.m. October 11, she finished off her first victim, a small, heavily loaded diesel freighter. That night, close to the shore, another small freighter was sunk. Tang now steered for Turnabout Island off Haitan, the landmark where, for thousands of years, shipping northbound through Formosa Strait had changed course for Foochow. Shortly after midnight, 23 to 24 October, a convoy for the Philippines, 4 deeply laden freighters carrying planes, a transport with crated planes piled high on deck, a destroyer and several small escort vessels, headed right for Tang. O'Kane manoeuvred his boat inside the screen to a firing position where the ships seemed to overlap, bow and stern, on both sides of her. In a few minutes, 3 freighters were floating torches. The unhit freighter and the transport promptly converged on Tang with intent to ram. Lang, under a shower of small arms fire, slipped between the converging stems of these 2 ships and had the humorous satisfaction of seeing them collide after she had escaped. O'Kane headed north to relax for a few hours, surfaced before dawn 24 October, then turned in again toward Turnabout. After dark, the biggest convoy anyone on board had ever seen was tracked close to the jagged coast of Fukien, and as Tang closed, the Japanese escort commander obligingly illuminated his charges with a large searchlight, revealing 2 big transports and several tankers. These O'Kane selected as preferred targets and sank one. Tang then turned to fire 3 stern torpedoes at a tanker astern of the first victim, at ranges of 600 to 700 yards. The tanker was nicely hit and blew up, scattering burning gasoline over the Formosa Channel. After putting 5 miles between himself and the milling escorts, O'Kane slowed down to check his 2 remaining torpedoes. Both appeared to be in order, so Tang returned to the scene of her recent exploits to fire her 23rd and 24th torpedoes. The last, launched at about 2 a.m. October 25, broached, porpoised, reversed course, and within half a minute struck the submarine abreast her after torpedo room, and exploded. Tang immediately sank by the stern and hit the bottom 30 fathoms down. Sailors in the control room succeeded in closing the conning tower hatch, levelled off the boat by flooding tanks, and destroyed secret publications by burning. 30 officers and men reached an escape position in the forward torpedo room, where smoke from the burning documents, as well as lack of oxygen, knocked half of them out. Enemy escorts were depth-charging all about, but failed to discover the motionless sunken boat. At 6 a.m. October 25, 13 men, the only ones still strong enough to make the attempt, started leaving the escape trunk. 8 reached the surface through 160 feet of water. 5 of them, together with O'Kane, an officer and 2 sailors who floated off topside when she sank, were the sole survivors. These men were picked up by an escort vessel and given fairly good treatment according to Japanese standards. They were liberated at the close of the war. Bold fight-back tactics saved Salmon of Commander Halfinger's pack from becoming a victim of enemy escorts off the southern Cape of Kyushu on the night of 30 October. After she had sent 2 torpedoes into a tanker, 4 screening Japanese frigates forced her down, depth charges damaged her hull, and sent clocks, gauges, and other detachable objects hurtling about her compartments. Commander H.K. Naumann decided that his only chance was to fight it out with gunfire. Surfacing at 8:30 p.m., Salmon enjoyed a precious respite which gave the skipper and crew time to correct her list, plug holes, pump bilges, and get the engines turning up 16 knots. Around 10 p.m., one Japanese frigate began jabbing at Salmon like a dog attacking a bear, closing repeatedly to bark and retire. After this had happened several times, and the other frigates began to show signs of closing, Commander Naumann felt ready to take the offensive. Salmon attacked the frigate that had been dogging her, passing parallel on opposite course only 50 yards distant, raking topsides clear, knocking all the fight out of the Japanese and scaring away the other escorts. She then ducked into a rain squall, repaired battle damage, and made Saipan safely. American submarines hotly pursued enemy shipping in November, but found fewer targets. The enemy had become more wary. Singapore-Japan convoys no longer followed the west coast of Luzon, but hugged the western shore of the South China Sea, even as close as a mile or two. This month, however, brought rich increase in the bag of combatant ships. 4 submarines dogged a big convoy carrying an infantry regiment from Manchuria to Luzon, sinking 2 troop-filled transports. Then, by Pikuda, Commander O.O. Underwood, escort carrier Jinyo. Sealian's second, Commander G.T. Reich, sank destroyer Urakazi and tough old battleship Congo, north of Formosa. Archerfish, Commander J.F. Enright, made the biggest single kill of the submarine war on 29 November, the new 59,000-ton carrier Shinano. This Leviathan, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, had taken over 4 years to build. Provided with a 30-centimetre thick steel flight deck over a layer of concrete, she should have survived any amount of bombing, and her compartmentation was so complete that she was supposed to be unsinkable. Screened by 3 destroyers, Shinano sailed from Tokyo Bay on her maiden cruise at 6 p.m. November 28. Only 2 hours later, Enright made radar contact and dogged her, making 20 knots until 3 a.m. when she presented a perfect target at 1,400 yards range. Archerfish launched 6 torpedoes, 4 of which exploded on the carrier, whose skipper, believing her unsinkable, maintained speed and course for some 8 hours. She then rolled over and sank, taking down most of her crew. Shinano was surely the shortest-lived big warship in history. On 9 December at 1:34 a.m., Redfish, Commander L.D. McGregor, west of Kyushu, got 2 hits on 24,000-ton carrier Junyo. She was the carrier whose planes had bombed Dutch Harbor in 1942 and damaged battleship South Dakota in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and which had survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She was now so badly damaged as to be out of the war. Redfish was really in the money. On 19 December, she had a crack at another carrier, new 17,500-ton Unryu, escorted by 3 destroyers. The group conveniently zigged toward Redfish, which at 4:35 p.m. fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. One hit the carrier aft, stopping her dead and causing her to burst into flame. While destroyers milled about, dropping depth charges indiscriminately, Commander McGregor reloaded his tubes and at 4:50 p.m. fired a torpedo, which hit just abaft the carrier's island. Unryu went down within 20 minutes. Her escorts gave Redfish some heavy jolts from a cluster of depth charges, but she escaped by lying on the bottom until dark. Admiral Halsey's foray into the South China Sea in mid-January 1945 almost completely halted Japanese ship movements in those waters. But Rear Admiral James Fife, who had just relieved Admiral Christie as Commander Submarines Southwest Pacific, was taking no chance of missing anything. He maintained about 20 boats in that sea and around Borneo. On 24 January 1945, one of them scored well. Blackfin, Commander W.L. Kitch, picked up a convoy, made a surface approach and 1 hit, which sank destroyer Shigure, miraculous survivor of many battles, including Surigao Strait. Blackfin's exploit was emulated by Pargo Commander D.B. Bell off the coast of Indochina on 19 February. A night torpedo attack on a zigzagging destroyer was followed by a tremendous explosion which tore the destroyer apart. That was the end of Nokaze, the 39th and last Japanese destroyer to be destroyed by an American submarine. Flasher, Commanders R.1 Whitaker and G.W. Grider, the same month, completed her sixth war patrol, establishing a record for tonnage sunk by any United States submarine, 21 ships totaling over 100,000 tons. So much for the last operations of Southwest Pacific submarines, whose main base had now been moved up to Subic Bay, Luzon. It was much the same story, growing scarcity of targets for Pacific Fleet submarines, now mostly operating from Guam. Small escort vessels, coastal Maris and the like were the usual victims, but Balao, Commander R.K.R. Worthington, operating in the Yellow Sea on 19 March, bagged a 10,413-ton transport. One of the most successful and carefully planned submarine offensives of the war was Operation Barney, the invasion of the Sea of Japan, the only remaining body of water where enemy shipping still moved freely. This project of Admiral Lockwood's completed the ring around Japan by shutting her off from the Asian mainland. A wolf pack under Commander E.T. Heidman in Sea Dog, known as Heidman's Hellcats, was selected for the first penetration of the Sea of Japan. Sailing from Guam on 27 May, these 9 submarines headed for the Strait of Tsushima. en route Hellcat Timosa picked up 10 survivors from a B-29, which had splashed south of Kyushu. But when the rescued aviators learned of this boat's mission, they expressed a unanimous desire to return to their rubber raft and wait for a different rescue. Tinosa and her 8 sister boats passed through Tsushima Strait on 5 to 6 June. After reaching their assigned patrol stations on the GTH, they began knocking them off. In 11 days, 27 merchantmen for a total of 57,000 tons. The Hellcats made their exit by La Perouse Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, but without Bonefish, which had mysteriously perished. Admiral Lockwood followed up this foray, and 6 more submarines operated in the Sea of Japan until VJ Day. During the waning months of the war, the aircraft lifeguard service by submarines was an even greater contribution to victory than the destruction of enemy shipping. This system, originally set up during the Gilbert Islands operation in November 1943 in order to rescue downed aviators from carrier strikes, had picked up no fewer than 224 airmen by the end of 1944. By the close of that year, when the air effort had become one of the principal offensive elements against Japan, and B-29s were striking the Japanese home islands, it was necessary to step up lifeguard service. For each B-29 mission against Japan, at least 3 submarines, and usually more, were stationed along the flight route and near the targets to pick up aviators who were forced to ditch. During the 8 months that the Pacific War lasted in 1945, 86 different submarines rescued a total of 380 aviators. They were not the only means of air-sea rescue. Toward the end of the war, there was no point on the B-29 route that could not be reached by a Dumbo rescue plane in half an hour or by a destroyer or submarine in 3 hours. When the last B-29 strike on Japan was made on 14 August, the air-sea rescue team on station consisted of 14 submarines, 21 Navy seaplanes, 9 Dumbos and 5 ships. Merchant tonnage owned by Japan declined from about 6 million tons at the beginning of the war to about 2.5 million on 1 December 1944, despite the addition of some 800,000 tons by conquest early in the war, and 3.3 million tons of new construction. At the end of the war, she had only 1.8 million tons left in her merchant marine, mostly small wooden vessels in the inland sea. United States forces were responsible for the sinking of 2,117 Japanese merchant vessels of 8 million tons during the entire war. Of this destruction, submarines accounted for 60%, aircraft 30%, mines and surface ships 10%. Other Allied forces, mainly British and Dutch submarines, sent another 73 merchant ships of 211,664 tons to the bottom, and United States submarines accounted for 201 of the 686 Japanese warships sunk during the war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff on 3 October 1944 issued a directive to General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz, after providing covering and support forces for the liberation of Luzon, will occupy one or more positions in the Bonin's volcano group, target date 20 January 1945, and one or more positions in the Ryukyus, target date 1 March 1945. General MacArthur will provide support for subsequent occupation of the Ryukyus by Admiral Nimitz's forces. The strategic concept herein was to secure island bases for a final assault on Japan. Tokyo, Saipan, and Formosa make an isosceles triangle with legs 1,500 miles long. The eastern leg, Saipan-Tokyo, was about to be used by B-29 superforts to bomb the Japanese homeland, but a halfway house was wanted, and Iwo Jima alone fitted the bill. Formosa, having been rejected as too difficult to capture, the western angle of the strategic triangle was shifted to Okinawa in the Ryukyus, several hundred miles nearer to Japan and less stoutly defended. Owing to the unexpectedly prolonged and bitter defence of Leyte and Luzon, target dates in the 3 October directive could not be kept, and this gave the Japanese another month to make Iwo Jima almost impregnable. The Iwo Jima operation was placed first because it was expected to be easier than Okinawa. The same Pacific Fleet would have to cover and support both, while 7th Fleet and Amphibious Force were engaged in covering and liberating the southern Philippines, as described in our previous chapter. Iwo Jima, central island of the volcano group of the Nanpo Shoto or Bonin Islands, was uninhabited except by the Japanese garrison. Shaped like a bloated pear, Iwo is only 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. The inactive volcanic crater of Mount Suribachi rises 550 feet above sea level. The northern part of the island is a plateau with rocky, inaccessible shores, but beaches extend from the base of Mount Suribachi for more than 2 miles north and east. These beaches, the land between them, and a good part of the terrain, are deeply covered with brown volcanic ash and black cinders, which look like sand, but are so much lighter than sand that walking is difficult and running almost impossible. This grim island, which cost us so dear to wrest from the enemy, was wanted for one thing only: to provide for emergency landings of the B-29s on their bombing missions from the Marianas to Tokyo, which began 24 November 1944, and to base fighter planes for their escort, since no fighter plane could fly the entire distance. Iwo Jima underwent the most prolonged and also the most disappointing air bombing and naval bombardment of any Pacific island. The 7th Army Air Force, Major General Willis H. Hale, raided it 10 times in August, 22 times in September, 16 times in October. On 8 December it began daily strikes. 3 heavy cruisers, Chester Flag, under Rear Admiral Alan E. Smith, bombarded Iwo on 8, 24 and 27 December and 5 and 25 January. Chi-Chi and Ha-Ha-Jima were also pounded in order to prevent reinforcements from reaching Iwo, but they did. For 2 weeks, from 31 January 7th, Army, Air Force or forces bombed the island night and day, and the B-29s bombed it twice. Some 6,800 tons of bombs and 22,000 rounds of shell from 5-inch up to 16-inch were aimed at Iwo Jima before the invasion. Unfortunately, Iwo's defences were of such a nature that neither air bombing nor naval bombardment, no matter how prolonged, could neutralise them. The slopes of Mount Suribachi contained a labyrinth of dug-in gun positions for artillery, mortars and machine guns. These were accompanied by elaborate cave and tunnel systems to provide living quarters and storage space for weapons. From the volcano's rim, everything that went on all over the island could be observed. The main feature of the bulbous part of the island was an intricate network of excavated caves, connected by deep tunnels. In some places there were 5 levels of these caves, each with several entrances, and most served the double purpose of protecting men and positioning weapons. A mortar could be set up at a cave or tunnel mouth, fired and then withdrawn out of sight. Many of the surface positions were so cleverly prepared that they were impossible to spot until they opened up, or until the protective camouflage was blown away by gunfire. This system, an elaboration of the new Japanese defense tactics first revealed at Peleliu, followed a battle plan drawn up by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi in September 1944. He was to transform the central island into a fortress. When the landings took place, the garrison must aim at gradual depletion of enemy attack forces, and even if the situation gets out of hand, defend a corner of the island to the death. What happened is a lesson in the value of speed in securing strategic objectives. We could have walked into Iwo in September, right after securing the Marianas, but at that time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff was still arguing over what next. The original target date of 20 January would have been far better than the actual one of 19 February, but Sixth Army's pace in taking Leyte dictated the month's postponement. The Japanese Navy's only contribution to the defense of Iwo Jima was in the form of submarines bearing the human torpedoes, directed by one swimmer, which they called chiton. An initial success of this gimmick, sinking a fleet oiler in Ulithi Lagoon on 20 November, was not repeated. A chiton unit composed of 3 I-boats sailed for Iwo Jima 22 February. One ran afoul of destroyer escort Finnegan, Lieutenant Commander H. Huffman, when escorting a convoy from Iwo Jima to Saipan, and was sunk. In preparation for protecting the Iwo operation from submarine attack, escort carriers Anzio, Captain G. C. Montgomery, and Tulagi, Captain J. C. Cronin, were made nuclei of hunter-killer anti-submarine units, similar to those which had done such good work against U-boats in the Atlantic. Anzio's planes sank one chiton-bearing submarine a few miles west of Iwo Jima. The third reached Iwo waters, but was kept down by destroyers for over 48 hours, almost suffocating the crew, and then returned to base. Another, after a frustrating cruise around Iwo, constantly harassed by anti-submarine craft, was recalled. It seems odd that the Japanese Navy had not learned from our S-boats' lack of success in stopping their original invasion of the Philippines, that submarines are no good against an amphibious operation which has plenty of alert escorts. During the last 3 days before Iwo D-Day, there took place a series of carrier-borne airstrikes over and around Tokyo. These were laid on not only as a shield for Iwo Jima, but to destroy enemy planes and reduce Japanese capability for launching air attacks. They were successful in both objects, delivering a powerful 2 days attack on Tokyo airfields and aircraft plants on 16 to 17 February, but this did nothing to reduce the defences of Iwo Jima. This was a Fifth Fleet show, with the same Spruance-Turner Mitchell team that won Saipan and the Philippine Sea. Major General Harry Schmidt commanded the Marines. Pre-landing activities at the objective were under Rear Admiral William H. P. Blandy. Spike Blandy was the sanguine Celtic type, with a humorous Irish mouth overhung by a large red nose. As Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, his quick mind, grasp of essentials and driving energy had served the Navy well, especially in developing and manufacturing the Swedish Bofors and the Swiss Oerlikon as the 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, and he had commanded an amphibious group at Saipan. Blandy now had a fair-sized fleet, 8 battleships, including 4 which had helped cover the invasion of France, 5 heavy cruisers, and a flock of destroyers. They bombarded Iwo vigorously on 16 and 17 February, evoking no reply from the defenders until 7 landing craft, infantry gunboats, advancing in line abreast to cover the underwater demolition teams, drew a torrent of gunfire. All were hit and one was sunk, with an aggregate loss of 76 men, but they stuck to it and recovered the frogmen, who, after all this fuss, had discovered no underwater obstacles or mines. Another day's bombardment followed on the 18th. D-Day, 19 February, opened with the heaviest pre-H-hour bombardment of World War II by Spike Blandy's ships. Kelly Turner ordered land the landing force at 6:45 a.m. H-hour was easily met. Iwo was shrouded in the dust and smoke created by the bombardment, but weather conditions were almost perfect. The operation looked like a pushover. Optimists predicted that the island would be secured in 4 days, but the Marines were sceptical. A chaplain on one of the transports had printed on cards and distributed to each Marine the words of Sir Jacob Astley's famous prayer before the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, which well fitted the mood of United States Marines 3 centuries later. O Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I forget thee, do not thou forget me. At 1 minute short of H-hour, naval gunfire shifted to targets about 200 yards inland. At 9:02 it moved another 200 yards inland, and thereafter formed a modified rolling barrage ahead of the troops, constantly adjusted to conform to their actual rate of advance. This barrage was fired by the secondary batteries of the heavy ships, to each of which was assigned a shore fire control party with the troops. At 8:30 a.m., the first assault wave, consisting of 68 landing vehicle, tracked Amphtrack, the Amphtrack's tanks, left the line of departure. It hit the beach almost precisely at H-hour 9 a.m. Within the next 23 minutes, the remaining assault waves landed on schedule, and at 9:44 a.m. 12 landing ships, carrying medium tanks, beached. Up to the point of actually touching down, everything went off like a parade. Then trouble started. The landing vehicle, tracked Amphtrack, found their way blocked by the first terrace, which rose as high as 15 feet. The volcanic ash and cinders afforded poor traction, and men of the first wave were slowed down to a walk. A few Amphtracks advanced through breaches blasted by naval gunfire. Some backed into the water and fired their turrets at inland targets, but many bogged down on the beach. The volume and accuracy of enemy mortar fire increased heavily. A situation developed somewhat similar to the one at Omaha Beach, but here there was not even a seawall for protection to the troops, who found it virtually impossible to advance in the face of withering fire. General Kuribayashi's static defense now began to show itself. His troops cozily sat out the naval bombardment. As soon as gunfire lifted, they returned to their well-protected positions and opened up on the advancing troops. As the volume of enemy fire on the Marines increased, the gunfire of supporting ships offshore stepped up. Santa Fe was the star of the fire support cruisers. She laid almost continuous 5-inch and 6-inch shell fire within 200 yards of the battalion on the left flank of the STH division, with the result that hardly a shot was fired by the enemy from the base of Mount Suribachi, commanding their line of advance. Nevada became the sweetheart of the Marine Corps. Her skipper, Captain H. L. Grosskopf, an old gunnery officer, had set out to make his battleship the best fire support ship in the fleet, and did. Nevada, when firing her assigned rolling barrage about 9:25 a.m., found that her secondary battery could not penetrate a concrete blockhouse, and turned over the job to her main battery. This damaged a hitherto undisclosed blockhouse behind the beach, blasting away its sand cover and leaving it naked and exposed. At 11 a.m., when this blockhouse again became troublesome, the battleship used armor-piercing shells, which took it completely apart. At 3:12 p.m., Nevada observed a gun firing from a cave in the high broken ground east of the beaches. Using direct fire, she shot 2 rounds of 14-inch, scoring a direct hit in the mouth of the cave, blowing out the side of the cliff and completely destroying the gun. One could see it drooping over the cliff edge like a half-extracted tooth hanging on a man's jaw. Approximately 30,000 troops were landed on D-Day. There were 2,420 casualties, including 519 killed or missing in action, and 47 more died of wounds. The beachhead established fell far short of the planned phase line, but it already contained 6 infantry regiments, as many artillery battalions and 2 tank battalions. Darkness finally closed D-Day, a day such as Iwo had never seen since it arose a hissing volcano from the ocean. The Marines dug themselves in where night overtook them. Gunfire support ships moved out to night withdrawal areas, leaving only Santa Fe and 10 destroyers to supply star shell illumination and harassing fire on enemy positions. The expected big counterattack never came off. Banzai charges were no part of General Kuribayashi's plan. He intended to conserve his manpower, knowing that American sea and air power had closed all hope of reinforcement, and that it was hopeless to try to drive the Marines into the sea, but he intended to fight for every yard of ground, and did. The reduction and capture of Iwo Jima is a story of yard-by-yard advance against a tough, resourceful enemy who allowed no let-up, and who used his terrain to extract the maximum price in blood. The Marines, advancing in the open with little natural shelter, had to fight their way against an enemy burrowed underground and protected from everything but a direct hit. It was a costly and exhausting grind, calling for higher qualities of courage, initiative and persistence than a campaign full of charges, countercharges and spectacular incidents that maintain morale. It was like being under the lash of a relentless desert storm, from which there was no shelter, day or night, but this storm lasted 6 weeks and rained steel, not sand. General Holland Smith said that Iwo Jima was the most savage and the most costly battle in the history of the Marine Corps. and Admiral Nimitz observed that on Iwo uncommon valour was a common virtue. A pattern for the island campaign was promptly cut out. For daytime direct support, each Marine battalion had attached to it one or more destroyers with a liaison officer on board, and a Navy shore fire control party stayed with it ashore. At daybreak, the heavy support ships closed the island to fire a preliminary bombardment on targets selected by divisional and regimental commanders the evening before. After the Marines jumped off, the ships stood by for deep support on targets designated by the troops' shore fire control parties or by spotting planes. A special feature of gunfire support during the first week was the landing craft infantry mortar unit. With their shallow draft, these landing craft infantry mortars could work close inshore, often in a position to shoot up gullies at enemy targets invisible to the Marines. Escort carrier planes acted as winged workhorses of this campaign. While Task Force 58 raided Tokyo and Okinawa, the jeeps, almost within sight of Mount Suribachi, fed out call bombing and rocketing missions and provided combat air patrol and anti-submarine patrol from before D-Day to 9 March. The daily task of providing air support, observed their commander, Admiral Durgin, is not broken even for replenishing and refueling. It is a continual grind from dawn to dark each day. Owing to Iwo's distance from Japanese air bases, the Navy there was not much bothered by kamikazes. One, however, crashed Saratoga about 35 miles northwest of Iwo on 21 February, and 5 more attacked, adding a bomb to her collection. She lost 42 planes burned, jettisoned or splashed, 123 men killed and 192 wounded, but she was able to steam under her own power to a West Coast yard. It took a friendly atomic bomb at Bikini to put much-bopped old Sarah down for keeps. Also on the evening of 21 February, escort carrier Bismarck C was crashed by a kamikaze starting gasoline fires and explosions that did her in and killed 218 of her crew. Simultaneously, several Japanese torpedo bombers attacked escort carrier Lunga Point. All torpedoes missed, but one plane skidded across the flight deck with propeller chewing up the planking and plunged into the sea. The damage was slight, and nobody but the pilot was killed. These, together with hits on net cargo ship Keokuk and landing ship, Tank 477, make up the total enemy aircraft damage in the Iwo Jima operation. It seemed a good omen for Okinawa, but it was not. On 23 February came the successful scaling of Mount Suribachi. Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge sent a 40-man detachment from the 28th Marine Regiment, commanded by First Lieutenant H. G. Schreier, to scale the volcano. As they scrambled over the rim of the crater, they were challenged by the last Japanese survivors on the opposite edge, and a hot little fight developed. Before it ended, at 10:20 a.m., a Marine picked up a length of iron pipe, lashed to it a small American flag that he had brought in his pocket, and raised it. This flag was too small to be seen through the fog of battle, but already a bigger one was coming up, a battle ensign from landing ship Tank 779, which had beached near the base. A Marine carried it up the mountain, and an Associated Press photographer arrived in time to take the famous picture of the second flag raising. Beginning 25 February. The Marines made slow but steady progress, gradually pushing the Japanese into the northern part of the island. The final drive was made 3 divisions abreast. On 4 March, the former Japanese airfield, improved and extended by Seabees, received its first call from a B-29, returning from Japan low on gasoline. General Schmidt announced Iwo Jima secured on 16 March and operation completed on the 26th, but there was plenty of ground fighting between these 2 dates, and even later. General Kuribayashi's radio informed Chichijima on the 21st. "We have not eaten or drunk for 5 days. But our fighting spirit is still high." It was indeed. His men continued to do all the mischief they could. On 26 March, before dawn, about 350 Japanese tried to brawl their way through an Army Air Force or Forces and Seabee camp, killing 53 and wounding 119 American officers and men, before being annihilated themselves. General Schmidt closed his command post 27 March, and the 3rd Marine Division departed. The 147th Infantry Regiment United States Army which had been arriving since 21 March, now took over responsibility for mopping up and garrison duty. Up to and including 26 March, the count of Japanese killed and sealed up in caves was 20,703, and only 216 had been taken prisoner. It was then estimated that only 100 to 300 of the enemy were left alive on the island. This proved to be far too optimistic. The army netted 867 more prisoners in April and May, during which time 1,602 more Japanese were killed. Isolated pockets held out even longer in various parts of the island. The United States Marines conducted this, one of the toughest battles in their entire history, with exemplary endurance, skill, and valour, and it was not a spectacular battle, but one of steady slugging against a relentless enemy. Battle casualties amounted to 30% of the entire landing force, and 75% in the infantry regiments of the 4th and 5th Divisions. The Seabees, who began to land on D-Day and to restore the No. 1 airstrip 5 days later, and 7,600 of whom were on the island 20 April, did the major work in making Iwo Jima useful to the Army Air Force. By the end of the war, about 2,400 B-29 landings had been made on the island, carrying crews of many thousand men. There is no doubt that the capture of Iwo Jima became a major contribution to victory over Japan. One B-29 pilot said, "Whenever I land on this island, I thank God and the men who fought for it." Okinawa in the Ryukyus, a name unknown to the vast majority of Americans before 1945, signifies an island where American forces seem destined to remain until the Cold War waxes hot or the communist menace fades. Under an earlier name, the Great Luchu, Okinawa became well known to Americans when, in that happy era before imperialism and colonialism became pejorative words, Commodore Matthew C. Perry was sailing about the Orient. In 1853, the Commodore raised the American flag near Shuri on one of the hills that cost us so dear to capture in 1945. He forced the King of the Ryukyus to sign a treaty guaranteeing friendly treatment to American ships, and even established a temporary coaling station at Naha Harbor. Japan only took over the group in 1879, and the Okinawans have never been completely assimilated to the Japanese. In 1945, the island, with a small rural economy, was overpopulated with almost 500,000 people. The countryside, with steep limestone hills, umbrella-topped pines, small cultivated fields and patches of woodland, recalls those Italian landscapes seen through the windows of Tuscan and Sienese paintings. But neither tower nor dome breaks the skyline. The soft limestone structure of the island lent itself to a deep, prolonged defence, such as General Kurebayashi's on Iwo Jima. Planning for this massive Operation Iceberg, described by British observers as the most audacious and complex enterprise yet undertaken by the American amphibious forces, began with a Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters, Pacific Ocean Areas Staff Study dated 25 October 1944. The detailed operation plan of Vice Admiral Turner was issued on 9 February 1945. Admirals Spruance, Mitcher and Turner, and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding 10th Army, were the four principal commanders. 10th Army was a powerful invasion force, comprising 3rd Fib Corps, Major General Roy S. Geiger of 3 Marine Divisions, and 24th Army Corps, Major General John R. Hodge of 4 infantry divisions with a 5th in reserve, a total of about 172,000 combatant and 115,000 service troops. D-Day for Okinawa was set for 1 April 1945. Planners and commanders were highly apprehensive of what enemy air might do to us before we could secure our own airfields on Okinawa. For the Japanese had several airfields there, and in the nearby islands, airdromes 150 miles away in the Amami Gunto, about 230 miles away on the Sakishima Gunto, and 65 airfields on Formosa, as well as 55 on Kyushu. Since no other operation would be going on at the time except in the southern Philippines, the enemy could concentrate an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 planes on the expeditionary force and employ kamikaze tactics, which is exactly what Imperial General Headquarters planned to do. The island commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who had 77,000 to 100,000 troops in his garrison, was ordered to employ the same defense-in-depth tactics as at Iwo Jima. Air power was not one-sided. Even before the bloody scroll of the Iwo Jima campaign was completely unrolled, the B-29s had begun a series of air raids with incendiary bombs on large urban areas of Japan. These, in the words of the Japanese collaborators to General MacArthur's historical report, rocked the nation to its very foundations. The attack on the night of 9–10 March in particular was indescribably horrifying. Well over 250,000 houses were destroyed, rendering more than 1 million persons homeless, and 83,793 people were burned to death. Compared with these, the results of fast carrier raids on Japan on 18–21 March were unimportant, and the kamikazes got in some good licks on Wasp, Yorktown and Franklin. The first named lost 101 dead and 269 wounded, but continued her flight operations. Franklin, Captain Leslie H. Garris, was very badly damaged, had to be towed clear by heavy cruiser Pittsburgh, Captain John E. Gingrich, and lost 724 killed and 265 wounded. Franklin was in much worse shape than Old Lexington in the Coral Sea or Old Yorktown at Midway, but the outstanding skill, heroism and stamina of damage control parties enabled her to make the 12,000-mile voyage to New York with only one stop. Neither Franklin nor many other ships crashed by kamikazes off Okinawa could have been saved but for the firefighting schools and improved technique instituted by the Navy, 1942 to 1943. The initial impulse came from the New York City Fire Department, which interested Rear Admiral Edward L. Cochran, Chief of the Bureau of Ships, in a new fog nozzle, which atomized water to a fine spray and quenched a blaze much more quickly than a solid stream could do. New York and Boston firefighters trained over 260 officer instructors and established schools with mock-up ships at every continental naval base. The damage control party of every new warship was trained at one of these before going to sea. The major object of this instruction was to get the fear of fire out of the sailor, to teach him that, if properly equipped with fire mask and helmet, handling an all-purpose nozzle and applicator, he could boldly advance to the source of a blaze and not get hurt. All ships were equipped with 160-pound handy billies, and the destroyers and larger types with 500-pound mobile pumps, each operated by its own gas engine. Portable oxyacetylene steel-cutting outfits and rescue breathing apparatus were provided. A foamite system was placed at every 100 feet of a carrier's deck. Foam generators in destroyers were moved topside. Salvage vessels were especially fitted out to help fight fires in other ships. Japanese authorities admit that losses from these carrier raids were staggering. 161 out of 193 aircraft committed shot down, in addition to an indeterminate number destroyed on the ground. These losses, luckily for us, prevented heavy participation by Japanese air forces in the defense of Okinawa until 6 April. 2 naval bombardment forces were brought up to the Ryukyus 8 days before the landings in order to give Okinawa and the vicinity a complete working over. Admiral Blandy's amphibious support force of escort carriers, minecraft, light gunboats and the like, and Admiral Deo's bombardment group of battleships and cruisers were given this job. Also under Blandy's command was a complete attack group, lifting an infantry division, to take the Kerama Retto, a cluster of small islands 15 miles west of Okinawa. This preliminary operation was the idea of Admiral Turner in order to secure the Kerama roadstead before the main show, as an advanced naval base for fueling, repairs and ammunition replenishment. The Kerama Retto landings, which would have been considered a major amphibious operation in 1942, went off like clockwork, and the group was secured on the 27th. Between 28 March and 8 April, 7 fleet tankers and 3 station tankers issued 940,000 barrels of fuel oil and 203,000 barrels of diesel, together with large quantities of lube oil and avgas, to 277 ships. Inside the roadstead, despite frequent air alerts, one had a feeling of security, like having a roof over your head in an air raid. As Rear Admiral Alan Smith wrote, Kerama gave a firmness to the Okinawa tactical situation. We were there to stay. with a place to tow damaged ships, look after survivors, replenish and refuel, drop an anchor. Aye, drop an anchor. For that boon alone, sailors blessed Kelly Turner, whose bright thought made it possible. L-Day, as D-Day for Okinawa was called, came on Easter Sunday, 1 April. It was preceded by 5 days of naval bombardment and air bombing. The 5 to 6 mile long strip of Hagushi beaches had been chosen for the landings because they gave ready access to 2 landing fields, Yontan and Kadena, and it seemed inconceivable that the enemy would abandon these without a fight. For aught we knew, the Japanese were holed up immediately behind the beaches, ready to give the boys hell when they stepped ashore. These beaches were bisected by Bisha River, which flows into the sea between 2 out-thrusting limestone bluffs. The cliff faces were honeycombed with caves and tunnels from which the landing beaches could have been enfiladed by gunfire. Behind every beach was a thick 6-toe, 10-foot-high sea wall of masonry and concrete. Both airfields were dominated by tunnelled and fortified hills. It looked as if landing on the Hagushi beaches would be as bloody an affair as Omaha, and that the 3 days allowed in the operation plan would be too little time for capturing the airfields. Everyone was wrong. What they thought to be difficult proved to be easy, and after the easy part was over, the tough fighting began. The Paschal sun rose over heavy, low-lying clouds around 6:40 a.m. April 1. It was a beautiful morning, perfect for an amphibious operation. Calm sea, just enough offshore wind to blow the smoke away, and to float the vari-coloured banners of the control craft. As the sun rose over the clouds, it cast a peach-like glow over the water and on the multitude of ships, some painted solid grey, some with striped Atlantic Ocean camouflage. These last had not had time to change clothes, as it were, having been hustled more than halfway around the world to meet Okinawa L-Day. At 6 a.m., Vice Admiral Turner in El Dorado took over from Rear Admiral Blandy the command of all forces afloat except the fast carriers. After wresting one position after another from the enemy, Turner was in fine fettle. He had just been attacked in the American press for wasting lives at Iwo Jima and compared unfavourably with General MacArthur. But little he cared for that. He was still the same driving, swearing, sweating Kelly, whose head could conceive more new ideas and retain more detail than any other flag officer in the Navy. His complicated landing plan could hardly go wrong, based as it was on 2 years' combat experience. In order not to overwhelm the reader with detail, yet do justice to the magnitude and complexity of this last amphibious operation of the war, I shall describe 1/4 part of it, the landing of one infantry division by boats and craft of Transport Group Dog, Commodore M.O. Carlson. Dog formed half of the Southern Attack Force, which was commanded by Rear Admiral Jimmy Hall of Normandy fame. His job was to land Major General Hodges under the Command Corps. The Dog transports, which had the 7th Infantry Division on board, were to land it on a front of 3,000 yards, the so-called Orange and Purple Beaches. Very early, the big attack transports, Harris, Flag, heave to about 7.5 miles offshore. Beaching craft proceed to an area 4 miles nearer, control craft mark the line of departure 4,000 yards offshore, and 17 specialist beaching craft, supply, water, hospital and so on, together with landing ship, Dock Epping Forest carrying boated tanks in her womb, heave to seaward of the landing ship tanks. Each control craft displays a banner of the same colour as the beach, with vertical stripes to distinguish between numbers 1 and 2 of the same colour. This is carried out consistently. Every boat waves guide flies a pennant of similar colour and design, and each landing craft of the initial waves has it painted topside. First wave ashore sets up corresponding beach markers about 10 feet high, brightly painted on canvas. Battleship Tennessee, Captain John B. Heffernan with Rear Admiral Deo embarked, and cruiser Birmingham, Captain H.D. Power with Rear Admiral Bertram J. Rogers embarked, close to 1,900 yards from the beach. En route, a Japanese dive bomber makes for them, but is splashed just astern of Birmingham, whose crew, in view of their earlier experiences, are pleasantly surprised at their escape. At 6:40 a.m., the naval bombardment opens and continues intermittently until 7:35 a.m., when it is raised to allow carrier-based planes to play their part. The sound of naval cannon is stilled, but the air is filled with the drone of airplane motors, the rolling rumble of exploding bombs, and the sharp, unmistakable crack of rocket fire. At 8 a.m. the cry goes up. Here they come. In the van are 12 landing craft, infantry gunboats, moving in perfect alignment at a deliberate 3 knots in order not to outdistance the landing vehicle, tracts. They pass around the battleships and open fire, their 3-inch guns rattling like old-time musketry. In 10 minutes' time, 3 boat waves, each flanked by flag-flying guide boats, have swept around battleship Tennessee's bow and stern, reforming on her landward side directly under her guns, which are shooting 14-inch, 5-inch and 40mm projectiles over the men's heads. The troops in green coveralls and camouflaged helmets gaze curiously at the battleship's flashing guns. The landing craft infantry gunboats are now close to the shore, their gunfire sounding like a roll of drums. Just as the 4th wave passes Tennessee, planes come in for their last pre-landing strafing and rocket fire, making a noise like a gigantic cotton sheet being ripped apart. The 5th boat wave passes, troops standing on the afterdeck to see what goes on. And a marvellous sight it is, these waves of landing craft extending parallel to the coast as far as the eye can see, all moving with a precise deliberation that well represents the stout though anxious hearts that they are carrying. At 8:28 a.m. word arrives that the first wave is 75 yards from the beach. Admiral Deo orders ceasefire. The landing craft infantry gunboats have halted outside the reef over which amphitracts of Wave 2 are already crawling, to begin their last dash through the lagoon. At 8:32 a.m. comes word. First wave has hit the beach. Waves 2 and 3 are on the reef. 4 and 5 take off from line of departure. Others are forming up as far as you can view seaward. As Tennessee weans ship, in order to give her starboard secondary battery a chance to shoot, the first signs of enemy opposition appear. Plumes of white water rise up between her and the beach. A mortar battery on the bluffs of the Bisha River is trying to get the range but never does. 6th wave is composed of landing craft, vehicles and personnel whose troops will have to be transferred to retracting landing vehicle, tracked to cross the reef. 7th wave includes 6 landing ships, medium for the purple beaches. These little sisters to the landing ship, tank are camouflaged by great blobs of green, yellow and brown paint, which light up to a modernist fantasy when seen in echelon. Yet there is also something curiously medieval about them. Nearly amidships rises a tall cylindrical pilot house, like the turret of a castle, with round ports, and the numerous gadgets which crown the turret have the effect of battlements protecting the helmeted sailors. Can it be a coincidence that the control craft for Purple 1 is numbered 1066? As the landing ships, medium pass, their bow gates are already open, ready to disgorge the newest amphibious vehicle, a medium Sherman tank supported by pontoons. 9 centuries of warfare and military architecture seem to come to a focus off the beaches of Okinawa. 9 o'clock. The sun has burned away the mist, disclosing an almost solid mass of transports to seaward, beaches swarming with amphitracts and men, troops moving through cornfields toward the tableland, landing craft forming waves, earlier waves retracting. Tanks can be seen swarming up the slope, orange and purple beach markers are clearly visible, landing craft bearing bulldozers and cranes pass. One is labelled Press in large white letters. Wind and sea have made up. No whitecaps yet, but enough chop so that landing craft pitch and throw spray. At 11 a.m., word reached Tennessee that the Marines in the northern sector had taken Yontan airfield, and that the troops in the army sector were on Kadena. All hands were stunned by the lack of opposition. Where are the Japanese? What is wrong with their elaborate installations? No one knew the answer. Officers looked at one another and shook their heads. The big joke that morning was the word passed by some corps humorist. The Marines are going so fast that they have already contacted the Russians coming up the other side of Okinawa. Throughout the afternoon, unloading on the beaches continued unopposed, and at 4 p.m. Admiral Turner reported that about 50,000 troops had been landed. The big transports were then withdrawn seaward for the night, and while they were retiring, Alpine and Akernar were crashed by kamikazes, losing 21 men killed. But they were able to discharge the undamaged part of their cargoes next day before retiring for repairs. Altogether, this Easter Sunday saw the most successful amphibious landing of the war, not so much owing to our own foolproof plan and tactics as to the enemy's decision to retire from the beach area. What could be his idea? The answer is that General Ushijima was rigorously applying the defense-in-depth tactics laid down by his superiors, and practiced at Iwo Jima, for opposing a landing force of superior strength. The idea was to lure the enemy into a position where he could not be supported by naval gunfire, and then wipe him out. The general concentrated most of his troops on the southern quarter of the island, hence the Marines, who were given the northern 3/4 to conquer, overran that part easily. For several days, General Hodge's 24th Corps felt its way south, and not for a week did the real land battle begin. In the meantime, the Navy had effectively sealed off the Big Island from any possible reinforcement. There would be no Tokyo Express to Okinawa. The enemy did try one desperate surface lunge at the amphibious forces, but Task Force 58 dealt effectively with that sacrificial sortie. United States submarines Threadfin and Hackleback, on the evening of 6 April, reported a sizable force debouching from Bungo Suido, the southern entrance to the inland sea. It consisted of Yamato, light cruiser Yabagi, and 8 destroyers. Their objective, in concert with the opening day of Operation Tengo, the massed kamikaze attack, was to knock off whatever ships the kamikazes left afloat. They were not expected to return, and only 4 destroyers did so. Yamato had only fuel enough for a one-way trip, and Yabagi had food for only 5 days. But their magazines were fairly bursting with ammunition. Yamato had over 1,000 rounds for her main battery. This mammoth battle wagon, which had been through the battles of Midway, the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf with little damage and still less effect, was 863 feet long and displaced 72,908 tons when fully laden. Her main battery consisted of 9 460mm 18.1-inch guns, which threw a projectile weighing 3,200 pounds, and had a maximum range of 42,000 metres, 22.5 miles. Her complement was 2,767 officers and men. She had radar and 150 anti-aircraft and machine guns, 4 turbine engines, developing 150,000 horsepower, gave her a maximum speed of 27.5 knots. This surprising ratio of speed to weight was attained by a unique hull design. Yamato was a very beautiful ship, with a graceful sheer to her flush deck, unbroken from stem to stern, and a streamlined mast and stack. She and her sister Musashi, sunk in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, would have inaugurated a new standard for battleship construction, as His Majesty's ship Dreadnought had done 40 years earlier. If air and missile power had not doomed the big-gunned capital ship. So this last sortie of Yamato has a sentimental interest for all sailors. When she went down, 5 centuries of naval warfare ended. This Special Surface Attack Force, as it was called, under the command of Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, sailed through the inland sea. It sortied from Bungo Suido at 8 p.m., naked of air cover. That rendered this forlorn hope of the Japanese Navy completely hopeless. With exceedingly bad judgment, the now unified Japanese Air Command hurled all available fighter planes against the amphibious forces around Okinawa, and at Task Force 58, instead of covering Yamato. Mitcher's fast carriers were in fine shape and vast strength, despite the recent crashes which had sent Franklin, Wasp and Saratoga home for repairs. He was in Lexington, while Spruance flew his flag in New Mexico of the Bombardment and Fire Support Group. Both admirals expected Yamato to sortie, and assumed that she would approach through the East China Sea, which we dared not enter owing to the mines, and make a night run to Okinawa. Consequently, she might escape notice of the Task Force 58 searchplanes, operating from east of Okinawa, but Spruance prepared to get her one way or another. The submarine's report of her coming out of the inland sea on the evening of 6 April enabled Mitcher to get 3 of his task groups up north within striking position and to fly searches at dawn. An Essex plane at 8:23 a.m. April 7 flushed Yamato and her consorts after she passed through Van Diemen Strait, making 22 knots and working west in the hope of keeping out of carrier planes' range. As soon as he heard this, Spruance signalled to Mitcher, You take them, and he did. At the same time, he ordered Admiral Deo's bombardment force to prepare for a surface action northwest of Okinawa, in case the Japanese broke through the air barrier. So, at 3:30 p.m. April 7, outnumbered the old battle wagons none too cheerfully. Deo's Chief of Staff, Rafe Bates, taking care to point out that Yamato's guns had a range of 45,000 yards, as compared with 37,000 for Tennessee's main battery. But by that time Yamato was no more. It was a mizzling day with low overcast, ideal for air attack. 2 tender-based patrol bomber, Martins from Okinawa, shadowed the Japanese force for 5 hours, sending valuable information to Mitcher and coaching in the carrier plane strikes. The first of these struck at 12:32 p.m. April 7. Within 10 minutes, Yamato had received 2 bombs and 1 torpedo hit. 1 destroyer was sunk and the light cruiser knocked out. Between 1 p.m. and 2:17 p.m., the force was under almost continuous air attack. Anti-aircraft gunners, for want of practice, were unable to shoot down more than half a dozen of the American planes, which piled in one after the other, in deuces and trays, bombing and torpedoing, reducing Yamato's topsides to a shambles, knocking out every gun. Ensign Yoshida, a survivor, has vividly described the scene in the final attack, when her list had increased to 35 degrees. I could hear the captain vainly shouting, "Hold on, men! Hold on, men!" I heard the executive report, "Correction of list hopeless." Men were jumbled together in disorder on the deck, but a group of staff officers squirmed out of the pile and crawled over to the commander-in-chief for a final conference. Admiral Ito struggled to his feet. His chief of staff then arose and saluted. A prolonged silence followed, during which they regarded each other solemnly. The deck was nearly vertical, and Yamato's battle flag was almost touching the billowing waves. Shells of the big guns skidded and bumped across the deck of the ammunition room, crashing against the bulkhead and kindling the first of a series of explosions. At 2:23 a.m. the ship slid under completely, followed by the blast, rumble and shock of compartments bursting from air pressure and exploding magazines already submerged. Light cruiser Yahagi proved almost as tough as the battleship, taking 12 bomb and 7 torpedo hits before going down. 4 destroyers were sunk or scuttled. 4 others, damaged, managed to get back to Sasebo. Yamato alone lost 2,488 officers and men, and the other ships, 1,167. Our losses, including those from a kamikaze crash on carrier Hancock at noon, were about 15 airplanes and 84 sailors and aviators. So farewell to the battle wagons. Japan had only one left, Haruna, shortly to be taken apart by air bombing. Most of those of the United States and Royal Navies were still prancing about with the carriers, unconscious that they too would soon be headed for the boneyard, although one would be honoured as the scene of Japanese surrender. But not another battleship was ever built. Their long day was now closing. The roar of the big guns would never again be heard, because weapons 1,000 times as destructive were to take their place. A Japanese aviator rescued from the sea boasted to his captors in Hancock that they would all be killed by a second massed kamikaze attack on 11 April. So Task Force 58 got ready for them. True enough, Missouri was crashed once, Enterprise twice, and Destroyer Kidd once, but they suffered comparatively slight damage. Since 26 March, the Royal Navy's Pacific Fleet contingent, including carriers Indomitable, Victorious, Illustrious, and Indefatigable, under Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings in His Majesty's ship King George V, was performing a useful mission of covering the Sakashima Gunto, pounding down airfields, and intercepting Japanese planes from Formosa. In so doing, the British carriers were proving the value of steel decks, which American naval architects had rejected on account of their weight. A kamikaze crashing a steel flat-top crumpled up like a scrambled egg and did no damage beyond its immediate vicinity. But a kamikaze crashing an American wooden deck started serious fires, and its bombs penetrated the ship's interior. On the other hand, the Royal Navy carriers were short on fuel capacity and had to retire to refuel every week or so. During that time, Admiral Durgin had to send 4 of his escort carriers from off Okinawa to take the places of the British off Sakashima Gunto. This pattern of wide support by the British carrier forces continued throughout the Okinawa campaign. The peculiar prolonged hazard to the Navy during this Okinawa campaign was the kamikaze, a series of massed kamikaze attacks, for the first of which Yamato was supposed to mop up, were laid on between 6 April and 22 June, constituting Operation Tengo. Prior to and in between these rikusui, floating chrysanthemum, massed attacks, as the Japanese called them, there were individual kamikaze exploits. Besides those already noted on the landing day, the following were successful during 2 to 5 April, destroyer transport. Dickerson was crashed on her bridge, killing her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Ralph E. Lounsbury, the executive, and 52 more officers and men, and she had to be scuttled. Transports Telfair, Goodhue and Henrico were crashed, and the last named lost the division commander, the skipper, 2 army colonels and 45 other sailors and soldiers. The ship survived, but she was out of the war. Admiral Turner's screening plan for protecting the expeditionary force in and around Okinawa was unusually comprehensive. He set up 2 anti-submarine destroyer screens, an inner and an outer, a destroyer screen to cover possible approaches of surface raids, a flycatcher screen to catch suicide motorboats, and most important, the radar picket screen, composed primarily of destroyer types, but supported by landing craft infantry gunboats and other small craft. These radar picket stations were the posts of greatest danger. They were disposed around Okinawa at distances of between 15 and 100 miles from land, so as to pick up flights of approaching enemy planes and, with the aid of combat air patrol, to intercept them. From 26 March on, each station was kept by a destroyer type, with a fighter director team on board. This controlled the combat air patrol, maintained all day by Admiral Durgin's escort carrier planes. The picket vessel patrolled night and day within 5 Thosuand yards of her station, and when bogies appeared on her radar screen, the fighter director officer vectored out combat air patrol to intercept. By this means a large proportion of enemy planes approaching Okinawa was shot down before they reached the island, and our forces engaged in landing, unloading or fire support were given timely warning of an air raid. Hundreds of sailors lost their lives, and about a score of ships and craft were sunk rendering this service. The fast carrier forces too had their radar pickets, and the casualties to these, while less serious than to those around Okinawa, because more difficult for enemy planes to locate, were formidable. They are included in this table of 10 rikusui attacks, which constituted the better part of Operation Tengo. Counting all planes in these mass attacks, together with individual kamikaze attacks not included in the table, over 3,000 sacrificial sorties were launched against American naval forces in the Okinawan campaign. In addition, there were hundreds of attacks by conventional dive bombers and torpedo planes. The total number of Japanese aircraft involved is not known, but the Japanese Navy counts 3,700 sorties by Navy planes, including fighter escorts and conventional bombers. The sorties of Army planes, if in the same proportion to Navy as in the Kikusui attacks, would add some 2,600 more. A book might well be written about each of the 6 greater Kikusui attacks, with inspiring details of heroism and suffering on the part of the crashed ship's crews. We shall have to content ourselves here with samples only. In the first and biggest Kikusui attack, to which no fewer than 355 kamikazes were committed, destroyers Leutze and Newcomb bore the brunt. In quick succession, 1 kamikaze crashed Newcomb's afterstack, a second was splashed, and a third, carrying a large bomb, crashed her amidships, gouging deep into her bowels with a tremendous explosion that cut off all remaining sources of power and blew both engine rooms and the after-fire room into a mass of rubble. With intentions of polishing us off, wrote her skipper, Commander I.E. Macmillan, a 4th plane raced toward Newcomb from the port beam, and although under fire by her forward batteries came through to crash into the forward stack, spraying the entire amidships section of Newcomb, which was a raging conflagration, with a fresh supply of gasoline. Flames shot up hundreds of feet, followed by a thick pall of smoke and spray, which so completely covered the destroyer that sailors in nearby battleships thought that she had gone down. Destroyer Leutze, closing rapidly to render assistance to Newcomb, observed with astonishment that she was still holding together. A solid mass of flame swept from bridge to No. 3 gun, but her valiant skipper and crew showed no intention of abandoning ship. Lieutenant Leon Grabowski, commissioned officer of Leutze, gallantly risked his ship to help her sister, closed her weather side 10 minutes after the first crash, and passed hose lines on board to help fight fires. Then a fifth plane approached, heading for Newcomb's bridge. One of her 5-inch guns, fired in local control, made a hit which tilted the plane just enough so that it slid athwartship and onto Leutze's fantail, where it exploded, jamming the rudder. Now Leutze too was in trouble. While one of her repair parties continued fighting fires on board Newcomb, 2 others checked flooding on their own ship and jettisoned topside weights. 17 compartments laid open to the sea by the Japanese bomb let in so much water that Leutze began to settle. Destroyer Beale, fire hoses streaming, now closed the disengaged side of Newcomb, and Leutze signalled, "Am pulling away, in serious danger of sinking." But Minesweeper Defence, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Abbott, already damaged by 2 kamikaze hits shortly after 6 p.m., towed Leutze to Kiramaretto. Both destroyers had to be scrapped. They were lucky to lose only 47 men killed or missing. These ships belonged to the gunfire support screen. Radar picket destroyers fared even worse. Bush, Commander R.E. Westholm, on Radar Picket Station No. 1, and Colquhoun, Commander G.R. Wilson, on Station No. 2, were the first to be encountered by floating chrysanthemums flying southwest along the Nansei-Shoto. Advance elements of the massed air attack heckled them all through the midwatch, and Colquhoun was subjected to 11 bombing attacks, all of which missed, between 2:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. April 6. The forenoon watch was fairly quiet. Around 3 p.m., 40 to 50 planes flew down from the north, stacked at various altitudes between 500 and 20,000 feet, and began orbiting and attacking Bush, while about 12 others went after Cassin Young at Station No. 3, next to the eastward. Bush shot down 2 Vals and drove off 2 more. 13 minutes later, a Jill was sighted heading low for her. Fire was opened at a range of 7,000 yards. The plane jinked and wove at an altitude of 10 to 35 feet above the water. And although every gun on the destroyer was firing, it kept coming and crashed between the 2 stacks. The bomb exploded in the forward engine room, killing every man there and in the 2 fire rooms. Flooding started immediately, and Bush took a 10-degree list, but escaping steam smothered the fires, and power was regained as the auxiliary diesel generator cut in. Handy-billies were used to control the flooding, the wounded were treated on the fantail or in the wardroom, and although the ship had gone dead, everyone expected to save her. All hands cheered when a combat air patrol of 4 planes appeared overhead. Colquhoun, learning by radio that Bush needed help, began to close at 35 knots, bringing along her combat air patrol for the short time it could remain. At 4:35 p.m. she closed Bush, apparently foundering. She signalled a support craft, LCS-64, to rescue the crew, and tried to interpose herself between the sinking ship and a flight of about 15 Japanese planes. They approached, and one went for Bush at 5 p.m. Commander Westholm ordered about 150 of his men fighting fires topside to jump overboard for self-protection, and trailed knotted lines for them to climb on board again. All his 5-inch guns that would bear were jammed in train, but his 40mm guns opened fire. Colquhoun shot every gun she had at an approaching Zeke, which splashed midway between the 2 ships. Another was hit by a 5-inch shell at 4,000 yards and caught fire. Colquhoun's guns numbers 1, 2 and 3 were quickly trained on a third, diving at her starboard bow, and the first salvo hit him square on the nose. He splashed 50 yards abeam. Just then, Commander Wilson received a report that a 4th Zeke was about to crash his port bow. Too late, he ordered full left rudder. The plane, already aflame, hit Colquhoun's main deck, killing the gun crews of 2 40mm mounts. Its bomb exploded in the after fire room, killing everyone there and rupturing the main steam line in the forward engine room. A quick decision by the engineer officer to open the cross-connection valve enabled Colquhoun to maintain a speed of 15 knots. She was already getting fires under control when the 5th attack within 11 minutes came in. 2 kamikazes were splashed, but a 3rd crashed, blowing a great hole below the waterline and breaking the ship's keel. While the damage control parties were working, and 3 5-inch guns were being fired manually, a 6th attack came in. 2 planes were splashed, but a third and a fourth crashed bush, killing all the wounded in the wardroom and starting a fierce fire. Still, neither commissioned officer would give up his ship. At 6 p.m. a kamikaze crashed Colboon, already so badly damaged that this additional misfortune did not make things much worse. It was now dark. At 6:30 p.m. a big swell rocked Bush, whose structure was now so weak that she jackknifed and slid to the bottom. Commander Wilson of Colboun now decided to abandon his ship. At 7 p.m. Cassin Young closed to take off survivors and recover swimmers, and then sank Colquhoun by gunfire. LCS-64, a fleet tug and a PC, did their best to rescue Bush's swimmers, and those in floater nets and rubber life rafts. But complete darkness had set in, a high, crested sea had made up, and very many were drowned. Bush lost 94 officers and men out of 307 on board. Colquhoun, owing to Cassin Young's prompt rescue work, lost only 35 killed or missing. There was air-surface action all around Okinawa that afternoon and evening of 6 April. Destroyer Emmons and landing ship, tank and 2 victory ships carrying ammunition were sunk. 6 other destroyer types were crashed. Every one of these put up a good fight. Most of them splashed 4 to 6 kamikazes before one got in. The massed attacks petered out on 7 April, but total casualties to the ships sunk and badly damaged in this No. 1 Kikusui assault were 466 killed and 568 wounded. And it must be remembered that most of the wounded in these attacks were horribly burned. They suffered excruciating agony until given first aid. For a man blown overboard, hours might elapse until a pharmacist's mate could relieve him. The medical officers did wonders if the wounded survived long enough to receive attention, and many men in rear hospitals, who looked like mummies under their bandages, breathing through a tube and being fed intravenously while their bodies healed, were cured by virtue of new methods of treating burns. Japanese losses were equally heavy, 355 kamikazes, none of which returned, and 341 conventional bombers, an uncounted number of which were shot down. But if the enemy could keep up attrition at this rate, the objects of Operation Tengo would be attained. Some destroyer officers insisted that a pilot bent on crashing could not be stopped by anything smaller than 5-inch shell, and that under the existing system of gunfire control, it was impossible to knock down planes in 1-2-3 order. Radar picket duty could be as suicidal for the picketing sailors as for the attacking Japanese, unless 2 or more destroyers were placed at each station and combat air patrol were provided at dawn and dusk, which the escort carrier planes were unable to do. But an encouraging factor was the prompt build-up of a land-based air force. Yontan and Kadena fields were no beds of roses for tired airmen. Japanese artillery shelled them daily. Strafers and bombers paid frequent visits. Yet by the evening of 8 April, 82 Marine Corsairs and 7 night fighters were based on Yontan Field, and more were brought up within a day or two by escort carriers. Of this number, 41 were already available for combat air patrol. In another week, if all went well, these would be increased to 144. The land-based night fighters could not be used for combat air patrol before 14 April, as their radar and calibration gear had not yet been unloaded. So the holes in the fleet's air cover at dawn and dusk were not yet filled. Close support duties for Operation Iceberg tied down Task Force 58 until well into June. It got away only to sink Yamato and strike Kyushu airfields. The Reserve Infantry Division, the 27th, was landed on 9 to 10 April, bringing the total number of American troops ashore up to 160,000. Really tough ground fighting now began. The troops were now up against lines that the enemy intended to defend, the edge of a complicated and heavily fortified region across the 3-mile-wide waste of the island, from a point south of the beaches to the Nakagusuku-1. This area included pillboxes with steel doors impervious to flamethrowers, and Japanese artillery fire was increasing in volume and accuracy. On 12 April opened the second Kikusui attack, of 185 kamikazes and 195 other planes. It was bad, but far less destructive than the first. Radar Picket Station No. 1, where Captain C.A. Buchanan was officer in tactical command in Destroyer Purdy, first took the rap. On station number 4, destroyer Manat El Abala, Commander A. E. Parker, had the dubious honour of being sunk by the first Backer bomb seen by our forces in action. This little horror was a one-way glider with 3 rockets as boosters, only 20 feet long with a wingspan of 16.5 feet and a warhead carrying 2,645 pounds of trinitroanisole. Backer arrived in the combat area slung under the belly of a 2-engine bomber. Its pilot had an umbilical communication with the bomber's pilot, who released him near the target. The suicide pilot had to pull out of a vertical dive into a glide toward the victim, if necessary increasing speed by the rockets to over 500 knots. The small size and tremendous speed of Backer made it the worst threat to our ships that had yet appeared, almost equivalent to the guided missiles that the Germans were shooting at London. This initial Backer attack was well timed. At about 2:45 p.m. April 12, Appalling was crashed by a Zeke which penetrated the after-engine room. Its bomb exploded, breaking the keel and the shafts, and Appalling went dead in the water and lost power. About 1 minute later, in came a Backer at 500 knots. It hit the ship on her starboard side beneath the forward stack, penetrated number 1 fire room and exploded. The ship's midship section disintegrated, bow and stern parted, and Appalling went down so quickly that 5 minutes later there was nothing on the surface where she had been except wreckage and survivors, who were being bombed and strafed by other Japanese planes. Fortunately, their picket station was also manned by 2 landing ship medium rockets, which closed to pick up survivors and rescued all the destroyer's crew, but 79. On that same day, destroyer Zellers and battleship Tennessee were crashed, but carried on. Friday, 13 April, broke bright and clear, but in every other respect it was a Black Friday. Just as first light dawned over Okinawa, devastating news came over ships' loudspeakers. "Attention! Attention! All hands! President Roosevelt is dead. Repeat. Our Supreme Commander, President Roosevelt, is dead." Half an hour after the morning watch came on duty, Franklin D. Roosevelt had breathed his last. We were stunned, recorded one Blue Jacket in attack transport Montrose. Few of us spoke or even looked at each other. We drifted apart, seeming instinctively to seek solitude. Many prayed, and many shed tears. In no section of the American people was the President so beloved as in the Navy. Blue Jackets went about their duties sadly, officers looked anxious, mess attendants appeared as if they had lost their only friend. The question frequently asked of officers, "What will become of us now?" indicated that sailors had looked to Franklin Delano Roosevelt as their champion in peace, their leader in battle, and their guarantee of a better world after victory. Radio Tokyo reported the president's death simply and decently, but Hitler, in his Berlin bunker, received the news with maniac glee, thinking it would end the war. Under Harry Truman, now President of the United States, the war effort did not slacken for a moment. On 16 April, hell broke loose again in the 3rd Kikusus attack, 165 planes strong. Destroyer Laffey, Commander Frederick J. Beckton, in Radar Picket Station No. 1, was the first to catch it at 8:27 a.m. Probably no ship has ever survived an attack of the intensity that she experienced. The kamikazes came in from every quarter of the compass. Combat Air Patrol accounted for a number outside the ship's gun range, and boldly flew into the orbit of her gunfire to intercept. During a period of 80 minutes in 22 separate attacks, Laffey was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, as well as being near missed by a bomb and by a 7th kamikaze which splashed close aboard. Her guns, fired in local control after the director was knocked out, splashed 8 would-be crashers. Laffey lost 31 men killed and 72 wounded in this memorable action, well described by Admiral Joy as standing out above the outstanding. But the ship lived. Towed into Hagushi roadstead, she was patched up and proceeded to the new repair base at Guam under her own power. Radar picket destroyer Pringle was sunk in this attack with a loss of 65 killed and 110 wounded. 4 others were badly damaged, and out in Task Force 58, Intrepid took her usual beating, losing 10 killed and 87 wounded. The little island of Ishima, west of northern Okinawa, wanted for land-based search radar, was invaded 16 April by a landing force of the 77th Division and secured on the 21st. It was here that the beloved war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed by machine gun fire when closely following the troops. After the 16 April attack, radar pickets had a respite of 12 days while the Japanese were readying more floating chrysanthemums. The fourth Kikusui attack of 115 kamikazes was spread over 27 and 28 April. One ammunition ship was sunk, one transport and two destroyer types were badly damaged, and the fully lighted hospital ship Comfort was crashed, with a loss of 6 Army nurses, 7 wounded patients and 23 others killed, and 52, including 4 nurses, wounded. Ashore there was bitter fighting during the last week of April, forcing the Japanese back to another series of caves and entrenchments. Each line of defence was stubbornly held by the Japanese, until the sheer weight of attack penetrated and forced abandonment. Then the process was repeated. The battle for Okinawa was the toughest and most prolonged of any in the Pacific War since Guadalcanal. Naval gunfire, state the Army historians, was employed longer and in greater quantities in the Battle of Okinawa than in any other in history. It supported the ground troops and complemented the artillery from the day of the landing until action moved to the extreme southern tip of the island, where the combat area was so restricted that there was a danger of shelling American troops. Night illumination with starshell, delivered by destroyers, was also a great help to the troops, thwarting Japanese tactics of infiltration and night attack. Mississippi, whose special assignment was the demolition of Shuri Castle, where Commodore Perry had been entertained in 1853, fired 2,289 rounds of 14-inch and 6,650 rounds of 5-inch in 6 weeks' duty off Okinawa. The 5th Kikusui attack on 3 to 4 May proved to be one of the worst. Destroyer Luce was crashed and sunk at Radar Picket Station No. 12. Station No. 1, manned by 2 destroyers, 3 landing craft infantry large and landing ship, medium, Rocket 194, really had it. Morrison, crashed by 2 Zeeks simultaneously, and immediately after by 2 antique wooden canvas biplanes, had to be abandoned in a hurry and lost 159 officers and men, over half her complement, besides some 100 wounded. The other destroyer, Ingram, was crashed but survived. The rocket landing ships, medium, was crashed and sunk. Total losses to the 5th attack were 2 destroyers, 2 landing ships, medium and 370 officers and men. The 6th big attack, of 150 kamikazes on 10 to 11 May, more powerful than the 5th, did even greater damage. Bunker Hill caught it in Task Force 58, losing almost 400 officers and men killed. Destroyer Hugh W. Hadley at Radar Picket Station No. 15 beat off almost as many attacks as had Laffey. She lost 28 killed and 67 wounded, including her commissioned officer, Commander Byron J. Mullaney, who survived long enough to write an eloquent report on the performance of his ship's company. No captain of a man of war had a crew who fought more valiantly against such overwhelming odds. Who can measure the degree of courage of men who stand up to their guns in the face of diving planes that destroy them? I know of no record of a destroyer's crew fighting for 1 hour and 35 minutes against overwhelming aircraft attacks and destroying 23 planes. My crew accomplished their mission and displayed outstanding fighting abilities. The 7th Kikusui attack on 23 to 25 May, of 165 kamikazes, was mostly beaten off by the radar pickets, but some planes penetrated the fire support area, where they sank destroyer transports Bates and Barry and landing ships, medium 135, and knocked out 5 more vessels. The 8th, on 27 to 29 May, the last to which more than 100 planes were committed, knocked out Brain and Anthony and sank Drexler at picket stations 5 and 15, with heavy casualties, 290 killed and 207 wounded. Few missiles or weapons have ever spread such flaming terror, such torturing burns, such searing death, as did the kamikaze in his self-destroying onslaughts on the radar picket and other ships. And naval history has few parallels to the sustained courage, resourcefulness, and fighting spirit that the crews of these vessels displayed day after day after day in the battle for Okinawa. The 8th Kikusui attack coincided with the relief of Admiral Spruance by Admiral Halsey on 27 May, when 5th Fleet again became 3rd Fleet, and Task Force 58, Task Force 38. Since 17 March, the fast carrier forces had been at sea, dishing it out and taking the rap, exposed to the threat of air attack day and night. With accounts so far of 90 ships sunk or damaged badly enough to be out of action for more than a month, this operation had proved to be the most costly naval campaign of the war. Throughout the ordeal, Admiral Spruance clung tenaciously to the principle that Okinawa must be secured. He never flinched, and no more did the officers and men of his command. A less serene and courageous man might, before reaching this point, have asked, "Is this island worth the cost? Is there no better way to defeat Japan?" But no such doubts or questions ever even occurred to Raymond A. Spruance. After 2 months of bitter fighting on the Big Island, a company of Marines on 29 May captured the shell of Shuri Castle. Naha, the capital, had already been occupied. At the outset of the final push, General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery. The 2 last Kikusui attacks on 3–7 and 21–22 June were small and relatively undestructive. On 21 June, when 10th Army drove through to the southernmost point of Okinawa, it could be announced that organized resistance had ceased. General Ushijima committed suicide next day. Base development began by Seaby battalions soon after L-Day. Buckner Bay, formerly Nakagasuku 1, and Kimu 1 were transformed into seaports, with docks and other cargo handling facilities. New airfields and a seaplane base were built on the eastern side of Okinawa, and airfields on Hiroshima. The face of the island was changed more than it had been for thousands of years by multi-lane roads, traffic circles, water points, Quonset villages, tank farms, storage dumps and hospitals. And by the end of the war in mid-August, base development had progressed to the point where Okinawa could well have performed its original purpose of serving as an advance base for the invasion of Japan proper. Although your historian himself has been under kamikaze attack and witnessed the hideous forms of death and torture inflicted by that weapon, words fail him to do justice to the sailors who met it so courageously. Men on Radar Picket Station, to survive, not only had to strike down the flaming terror of the kamikazes roaring out of the blue like thunderbolts of Zeus, they were under constant strain and intense discomfort. In order to supply high steam pressure to build up full speed rapidly in a destroyer, its superheaters, built only for intermittent use, had to be lighted for 3 and 4 days running. For days and even nights on end, the crew had to stand general quarters while the ship was kept buttoned up. Men had to keep in readiness for the instant reaction and split-second timing necessary to riddle a plane bent on sacrificial death. Sleep became the rarest commodity and choicest luxury, like water to a shipwrecked mariner. The capture of Okinawa cost the United States Navy 34 naval vessels, and craft sunk, 368 damaged, over 4,900 sailors killed or missing in action, and over 4,800 wounded. 10th Army lost 7,613 killed or missing in action, and 31,800 wounded. Sobering as it is to record such losses, the sacrifice of these men is brightened by our knowledge that the capture of Okinawa helped to bring Japanese leaders to face the inevitable surrender.